Okay, today we're going to talk about using pencils. So I went and got the best set we have. So this has everything from 2H up to H8B. And whenever you're looking at pencils, the designation of the letter corresponds to the number. If it's an H, that means it is a hard pencil. It makes a light line. The higher the number, the harder it is. If it's a B, it's a soft pencil. The higher the number, the softer it is. The advantage of this set, the set we generally use goes up to a 6B. This goes up to an 8B, which just means it has a little bit of a broader range. It also goes down to a 2H, so you can get finer and thicker lines. So observation-based, looking at a still life. We're going to presume you've already done thumbnail studies and you've chosen, looking between compositions, you've made the decision of what you want to work with. And to just save time to talk about technique, I then transferred, so I have my sketch based on the still life, which is off camera over there, that I'm looking at. Notice, just to review, from when we work in class, tend to use vertical axis to try to make sure that you get the shapes upright and balanced. And this particularly works if you're doing human-made or manufactured items. So in this case, we've got a cup, and at this point I've not put the handle on the cup, so I'm just going to finish that part. It's turned towards us. I made the decision to crop. So a lot of the items in this composition are cropped, and I can draw right off of my lines. I tend to like to put lines around the paper I'm working in, just because I feel like I'm claiming ownership from the start. Some people will work right to the edge of the paper. As I said, I tend to like to manually just line off the composition, the format in which I'm going to work. It also helps to remind you that from the beginning you're taking charge. This is something you were designing, and it's your decisions that are affecting how it's going to look. So I'm going to just get that. So now I get the handle in there, and there's two brushes that I played around with putting them in the composition or cropping them, and I decided I'd keep them in the composition. So I'm going to work on those a little bit. That nice long handle. So I still use the axis to help me to balance. I'm going to look at that metal clamped, and it has a name which I can't think of that holds the bristles. And notice I'm trying to balance it on that center axis I was using. And then where the bristles come out, it opens up a little bit. So I have that. Then I have a much broader brush. So this one has a center handle, but a much thicker, or center axis I mean, but a much thicker handle. So I'm going to look at what I have. And then try to balance that shape. On this side I see some of the dimension, some of the thickness. I can check my angle, so when I look and I hold the pencil up against the object I'm looking at, I see that this is a really sharp angle. So I'm going to get that angle in. And from this viewpoint, I'm only going to end up with the metal part of this. So now, let me check that. I'm not happy. So I did that angle. I realized that I needed to make corrections. And part of why you do the study sketches is to make sure that you take care of and feel comfortable with the problems that are drawing problems. So I have a white vinyl eraser. I took one and sliced it so that I could get a fine point. I have a sharpener, just so that as I'm working I have what I need. When I get this basic composition in place, I'm just going to lightly erase out all those guidelines. And I purposely left several guidelines because as I was working this sketch, I realized I didn't have the object positioned where I wanted it, and I was basing that on observation. I was basing on the proportion where one object intersected another object, where the height of one object was equal to another object. So now I'm going to erase all those extra guidelines. And this shape is clear, so I'm going to just lightly erase that back. This is solid, so whatever is showing through will not be needed because there's absolutely no transparency. And then once I get that basic, so that I have most of the shapes down and I've erased out most of the guidelines that I don't need. It didn't say at the beginning, this is a nice heavy stock, so I'm just working on it as slightly deckled, slightly marbled, probably 15% gray drawing paper. You could choose to work on white, you could choose to work on a darker value. If you work on a darker value, then you need to have both dark and light charcoal pencils. So now I've got my basic composition in place. I did all of this with a hard pencil. So the first thing I'm going to do is locate where are the darkest values. And value, which is dark or light because it is the material, is called local value. So when I look, I see that the handle has a distinct, it is a black glaze. So its local value would be very dark. So I'm going to come in there and I'm going to refresh and remind myself about cross-hatching, which we already worked with. And since the top of this is catching a little bit of light, I'm going to go along the side and I'm going to use a nice crosshatch. And then I'm going to come through that crosshatch with a corresponding contour. And when I get to the top, I'm going to just allow that to be a little bit more open, because I know when I start working on this, I'm going to eventually be building some finer sense of reflection into that. So now I'll just continue on my local value, because this is the very darkest object in my composition. So I'm crisscrossing. I'm not outlining and filling in. I'm trying instead to think, where do I see value? And once again, this top part is very shiny, so it's black, but it's catching a little bit of light. So I'm going to put a crosshatch value in there that isn't quite as dark. And then I'm going to look around and I see there is a glazed edge on the cup itself. So once again, that is a local value. It's dark because of the material. So I'm going to add that dark. All of this, I'm looking at the object, so I'm not working from my imagination. I'm not working from a photo, because in this case the objects are portable and easy for me to have right in front of me. If I had gone outside and done a bunch of sketches, quick sketches and photos, then I might come inside and work from those photos. But there's no need to do that when it's a still life or something that is easily observable. When you're working with direct observation, you just want to continuously be looking back and forth. So now that's local value. Those are dark because it is a black glaze that's on that cup. So then I'm going to go around and I look and I see that the lid on this is also dark. It's a nearly black and it has some paint spattered on it. So I'm going to just go ahead and use some hatch lines, begin to get that value in, and then a combination of more cross-hatching and drawing in with negative value, meaning using the eraser as a drawing tool. I'll refine those areas, which right now just look like rough white. Those are going to be where the paint is smeared. But I'm just getting in, I'm starting again with the dark. What are my local values that are the darkest values? So as I travel around, there's a black label over here. And this particular studio does not have, it has a lot of ambient light. It does not have one distinct strong light. So instead I'm going to do what we did when we were practicing with light and value and cross-hatching, and I'm going to just establish. So I'm going to establish that a stronger light is coming from my upper left and will flow through. That's going to become more important as I begin to develop value. So now I'm just going to use that crosshatch because I know that this label will have more dark as it goes around that object. But for now, I've got this very, see if we can read that, my 5B, so I've got a really dark pencil. So I'm still just going to sort of search around. Do I see any other places that there's dark value? And probably not that dark. So I'm just going to put that one down and move over a couple notches to a 2B. So it's soft, but it's not quite as dark. It's not quite as soft. And now I'm going to start just continuing to look for local value. So when I just looked up, I saw that this angle was really wrong. So while I still can, I'm correcting it. Erasers are not punitive. Not a bad thing. Eraser is just another tool. It takes the lines away. Pencils put the line in. Not bad if you're using an eraser. So this is a metal clasp on the brush. This is also metal. This one's gold, which we're working in black and white, so we're looking in terms of value. This one's silver. From my angle, there's a lot more value, a lot more contrast on the silver. So I have this 2B in my hand, and I'm going to just start to begin building up where I see the value. And because it's metal, it's not quite as rational, it's not quite as consistent as if it was just a curved white ceramic cup that has dark core shadow gradation towards light. Instead, it's reflecting. So I'm going to just start by getting in some of where I see those lights and shadows, and I'm just at this point using really basic cross-hatching to begin establishing where some of that value is. It's a light wooden handle, so there's not that much value, not anywhere near what I see on the chrome, but the side is in shadow, so I'll put some shadow there. So again, I'm cross-hatching, so I'm not filling in between lines. Instead, I'm looking for where the value is. And this handle, when I look, overlaps that one, so I'm just going to clarify that before I finish. There's a fairly strong shadow inside the cup since I have I said 2B, but I ended up picking up a 3B. So since I have a 3B in my hand, I'm going to just work with that 3B, and I'm going to go to the shadow over here. And since I know that's an interior curve, I'm going to just add some of that value. And I know there's going to be gradation. And this drawing is going to go on for a little bit of time because I sort of didn't state it at the beginning, but what you want to do when you get started on a drawing is say, establish for yourself, I want this to be a fairly high developed light and value, full range value contrast based on observation, which is called optical perception, and I want to spend about, let's say, 90 minutes. So if you know you have 90 minutes, that means I'm going to be developing this drawing over time. So when I put that first value in, that's not finished, but it begins to establish what I know is going to be a range of value, and I know that this has a cast shadow and I can see it, so I'm going to just start to put that in to suggest where that cast shadow will be. And I see that this has a cast shadow because it's leaning against that cup. So at this point I might let those be, and I'm going to just move the entire way around this composition based on the objects. And let's see, let's just flip and look at those. There they are, way over there on the table. So based on those, now I'm back to my drawing again. It's got this 3B. It's making a nice middle value. I'm just going to continue going through and locating. This handle has a color. It's painted, so it has local value. So I'm just going to go ahead in and just, again, I'm using cross-hatching, so I'm not blending this value. We'll do that, but right now let's just try to stick to cross-hatching, which is a line-derived value technique. So I'm putting the line on, and then I'm going to come through and I'm going to give it some nice cross-contour cross-hatching. And then I'm going to come up, this is gold. I'm just going to see there's more. It says local value, so it's not white other than in that one zone where there's shiny reflection. So I'll give it value the whole way down. It's actually darker than the cast shadow in the cup, so I'm going to enhance that shadow down here and enhance that shadow in there. Come up to the golden bezel, I think it's called, and I see it's really reflective, so I'm going to just use some nice simple hatch lines that are running in contour for now. I'm going to get some of that value just suggesting where that light and shadow would fall. And it has a sharp shadow where it's clasped onto the wood. The hairs of this brush, it's a nylon brush, and they're sort of a middle value. If I'm thinking of them in terms of black and white, they're sort of gray, where the bristles on this one are white. So I'll keep moving around. This container actually has water in it, so I'm going to establish where that line of water is going to be. It will sit in a parallel plane to what we've established already as the base of this shape. So I'm just going to check that shape again, check this shape. When I look at the actual object, I can see that there's value because it's reflecting sort of up to that edge of the water, so I'm just going to get some of that in right off the bat. And I'm moving a fairly quick cross hatch. In this point it's just a single direction hatch, and I see that there's literally a shadow, a reflected shadow that sort of is going along the back edge, starting where the water line is and going down. And then I'll just use a cross hatch that is following the contour of that back curve of this shape. It stops when I got to that top of the water, and then it sort of picks up again down here. So I'm just looking at what I see, and I'm putting that value down based on what it is that I'm looking at. The bottom is very dark, but I know it's not just a line, it's that soft curve that is reflecting and catching the shadow. So I can use a cross hatch down there. This is where I can bring in my eraser and even clean up these lines more. This side, I can see a pretty strong reflected shadow that is coming from that side of the bottle, and when it gets to this area where it is enlarged almost like a shoulder, then it thins and narrows as it comes down. It gets down here, it kicks back up, and now I see it going the whole way across the front of the bottle. So I'm just isolating these different areas, and as I draw a value, I'm basing it on exactly what I'm looking at that time. So I'm not trying to anticipate, I'm not trying to finish this with one thing. Realized I forgot that there's this little straw that comes the whole way down. It's bent. It's very cool because it bends over down into the water. It has some value on it, but it's very light, so I'll wait until I pick up a lighter pencil. I come up to this top, it's a green plastic, so it's a middle gray if I'm thinking of value. The light is coming from this side, so it's distinctly darker over here, but it still has local value, so even on the light side, it's still catching light. It's dimensional, so I'm going to pull that edge down so that the contour wraps around. Same thing at the top, I'm going to pull that. I'm going to just bring a couple cross hatches around. So now you're starting to get some sense of where the light and shadow is. What I have not done is started to suggest the cast shadow, but I can see the zone. That cast shadow from that light is coming away from the object. Light is over. No, I just decided to. So the light is coming from this side, so you can see that the shadows go opposite the light. So I'm just going to begin suggesting on this transparent object, spray bottle, that cast shadow is dark at the base and then very quickly lightens. On this solid plastic jar of paint, it's much more distinct, so I can go ahead in there and just establish where I see that zone of cast shadow until it hits this object. So I'm going to just clarify this edge for myself. Once again, light, you know it comes down. You can see that the cast shadow starts. You know in the back end the cast shadow's over there. So once again, I'm going to just establish that much stronger, and I changed and I'm using a horizontal hatch just so I can begin to build where that cast shadow is going to be. So now these objects are starting to feel solid, and I would just continue working. So I'm going to put this 3B that I've definitely given a lot of time to, and I'm going to pick up one of the, so I've got an HB, a much lighter pencil. This object is white, so it has shadow, but it's not, it's dark, so I can come into this one and I can begin to build my light and shadow. And all of this, since you're going to build up this drawing over time, first, as I start building this up, this is not the finished thing, but I see that there's a core shadow, and since I'm working with cross-hatching, I'm just going to start working from that core shadow towards the light on the left. So since this pencil is an HB, it's not making the dark lines like the 8B or the 3B that I've been working with. So I could just begin establishing that there's going to be a core shadow. It's going to go roll around towards that slight reflected highlight on that side. When I look, since it is somewhat reflective, I see that there's a shadow and there's also just a slight hint of reflection in it. So I'm just going to pull that. Everything is based on what you're looking at. So I'm just going to introduce a little bit of that value. So now I'm going to let that one be too. And as I said, I have one eraser that I sharpened. So as you work, if you see more lines that didn't get cleaned up in that original go over, then go ahead and just do that as you're working. So the handle is wood. It's a light wood. It doesn't have much value. I'll take this very light pencil and get rid of some of this. Bless you.
Is that the light source?
Yes. So we established a light source because while I have observation-based objects, it's got ambient light. So we just decided that we'd use the same kind of consistent, strong light that we did when we were doing crosshatch exercises. So at this point, this has a basic start of where the value is going to be. This shape doesn't yet. I began at the top by putting that dark value because this was local value. It's a black plastic. This is a black label that's on the jar. So now I need to start thinking there is some light and shadow on it, but very much like the cup, it's subtle. So I'm going to do a different technique. Since I've been doing just consistently linear intersecting cross-hatching, here I'm going to do a scumbled line. So I'm just using almost no pressure. I see a very light core shadow, and I'm just going to build a little bit of that very light core shadow. I wouldn't have had to choose to scumble. I could have done any other technique, and it's not like this particular surface has any texture, so I made this decision much more as a subjective decision. I think it's visually more interesting if the drawing has a variety of lines in it. If one of these things had been a highly textured object, then I definitely would have said this is, a desirable option in terms of your options of scumbled line, crosshatched line, stippled line. But we don't have those. So before I do that, I'm going to clean up some more lines I see that are left from the sketch. So I have no pressure on this pencil. I'm just pushing the pencil just enough to put down a little bit of value. So now I've got a basic sense of really primary light and shadow distribution on these shapes, except for this sort of fun, challenging grip on that spray bottle. So when I look, it has this little, and I don't know the names, it has this thing on the inside where the liquid is pumped up through, and that's catching more value, so I put that in. And I can see that where it's overlapped, having multiple layers, I see more dark, so I'm going to put, and I'm basing this dark just on what I see. And I see that the handle, which I missed that it's dimensional, I can see the side of it. And that's a little bit darker, so I'm going to just put a little darker value in there. This end, where it gets smaller, the little thing you turn to determine spray or stream or off, has more value on the outside and less value on the inside. So I'm just going to put some of that in. I can see that this side, this plastic side, has a little bit of value. So I'm just for now establishing that planar part. I see that as I go around the back, there is more value present where I can see through 2 layers of plastic to the back of this cap. I see on the bottom it comes here, and I can see that back edge coming in. So at this point, at least I have some basic value now in place for all of these parts. And at this point, we're going to take a break.